Yes, it's Brian Lehrer Live, but this show is less about what I think than about what you think. Get ready to call in and speak some truth as you see it. Tonight, it's largely about what New York Times columnist Bob Herbert thinks. It's also about the mayor launching his re-election campaign in Spanish on TV. Have you seen this? And we will take a look at one of the most famous paintings ever about New York and ask, why did the New York Public Library sell this New York classic to Walmart? But first, Bob Herbert, who joins us at a moment when the U.S. Senate seems poised to go nuclear. Vice President Cheney is the one who would push the political button over the issue of abolishing Senate filibusters against judicial nominees. Tonight we will talk about the so-called nuclear option and other issues with New York Times columnist Bob Herbert. He also has a brand new book that's a collection of his columns called Promises Betrayed, Waking Up from the American Dream. He really thinks that America is in deep, deep trouble and that we have stopped believing as a nation in our own national dream. Bob Herbert, welcome to Brian Lehrer Live.
Nice.
Good. I want to start with the conclusion of your book, which is about people's ignorance. And I thought we might start just by listing some of the facts that you provide in that conclusion to your book that you say Americans are ignorant of and that they should know. So you write, for example, the prevailing public policy is to shift college aid away from lower-income kids to their higher-income peers. It is?
Yeah, it is. So it becomes easier now for the more affluent youngsters to get even easier to get a college education, and more difficult for the less affluent. When you have, for example, the schools that had the lower tuition, the state schools and that sort of thing in New York City, CUNY, and et cetera, you have tuition rates going up. In many cases, tuition rates are getting out of the reach of these youngsters, many of whom are not eligible for scholarships or the kind of aid that would allow them to go to school full time. This is occurring at a time when a college education is more important than ever, because we're learning that the people who do not have a four-year degree, that the gap in terms of wealth and income is really widening between them and everybody else. In fact, it's only the folks with a four-year college degree who have been maintaining the standard of living over the past 20 years rather than falling behind.
But the aid is actually moving from the lower-income students to the higher-income students?
Yes, the outlets for aid and for college loans and that sort of thing are being made more available for the more affluent youngsters rather than the less affluent youngsters.
Another one, your words. Suburban families should understand why a household with two wage earners today has less disposable income than a household with a single breadwinner in the 1970s. Is that a known stat for average Americans today?
I don't think the average Americans realize that, but if you go back to the early 1970s, that was a time when still a fair number of families had single wage earners. The way the average American family has maintained its standard of living over the past 3 decades is, in most cases, having wives work and working full-time, so that now that is the norm rather than the other.
And I think I've read somewhere else that while average wages for women have gone up in that period, average wages for men have actually gone down.
Yeah, real wages, when you factor in inflation, what your money can buy. The real wages for the average American male worker has declined over the past 30 years. A real way, an easy way to make that clear is to just look at the minimum wage, which hasn't gone up. I don't know the exact number of years, but it's been a while now that it's been at, I guess, $5.15 or $5.25 an hour is the minimum wage. Well, inflation has continued. Even though it's been low, you've still had some inflation every year. So that minimum wage gets eroded. The same thing happens with wages up and down the scale.
Social Security goes up by law to keep up. The minimum wage does not for people still working. And this is one of your big themes. You wrote about it in your column last week, including another little-known stat that 2/3 of today's young adults are not living up to their parents' standard of living.
Right.
So in what way is this true?
To me, the essence of the American dream has always been not just that most people feel that they can make it in this country, and a lot of people, most people still feel that way, but especially that the next generation will do better than its parents' generation. And that's where we're really falling down now. The only ones who really have a shot at it right now are those who get a 4-year college degree. Everybody else is slipping behind. And the reason the generation hasn't fallen behind in toto is because more people are going to college than 30 years ago. But that is now slowing down because it's more difficult and more expensive to go to college.
If you want to talk to Bob Herbert tonight, maybe you've read him in the New York Times, and this is a rare opportunity to give him a call and ask him a question or sound off just a little bit. Bob Herbert is here, and we'll take your phone calls at 212-251-0801. Give us a call here on Brian Lehrer Live. Let's do another one. Little-known stats that people are ignorant of but that are important from your book. Only 2/3 of all 9th graders and only half of blacks and Latinos and Native Americans graduate with a regular diploma 4 years later. Is that a higher dropout rate than in the past?
Well, I don't know if it's a higher dropout rate than in the past because there was a time when you didn't have as many people getting a high school diploma or a college degree as now. But the real question you want to know is what that means for families and the workforce today. And college dropouts are really just getting hammered in terms of employment. I mean, in many cases, they just can't get a job. When they do get a job, they get these jobs with terrible wages, no benefits, and without a future.
High school dropouts.
Yeah, so you talk about family values, and I talk to these kids all over the country, and they don't even think in terms of getting married and raising a family. In many cases, they're just out there on the street hustling. And we're talking millions of people here. We're not talking small numbers of people.
And you follow that stat in the book by saying one of the saddest things you've seen in the African American community is this tendency for some kids to say that working hard and studying at school is acting white. Do you think that's very common?
Oh, I know that it is common, but here's the thing that, in fact, over the past few years now, it's gotten a fair amount of attention. The thing, I was talking to this professor up at Northeastern recently, his name is Andrew Sum, and the thing that is really not well known is that kind of thinking is now bleeding over into the blue-collar white community, especially males much more so than women. This idea.
So what would they consider? Because whites aren't going to say it's acting white, so what are they thinking?
No, what guys are thinking is that it's not macho. It's not a real male thing to go into class and do well. So what this professor is telling me is that you'll have guys in the classroom, they've got answers to questions and stuff like that, but they're reluctant to raise their hand. They're reluctant to stand up and show how much they know because it's not cool.
Does this mean that you take kind of Bill Cosby's debate aside in that debate about inner city values? We had Michael Eric Dyson on the show a couple of weeks ago, whose book speaks back to Bill Cosby. And Bill Cosby was out on Long Island just last night in Roosevelt talking these themes again. He says, quote, 50% dropout rate, I'm telling you, and people in jail and women having children by 5-6 different men. Brown versus Board of Education is no longer the white person's problem. We've got to take the neighborhood back. You agree?
Well, I agree that you have to take the neighborhood back, but where I think Cosby ran into a bit of a problem is that he sort of gave the impression, I don't think that he intended to, but he gave the impression that the onus has to fall on poor blacks, sort of just as a group, which is, I think, an awful thing to say. People in this country, black or white or Latino, who don't have enough money, have a tough road right now. It's very difficult to get employment, and if you get employment, it's very difficult to get a job that's secure and that has benefits and that pays enough to raise a family. So I think when you start talking about Cosby's approach to the values issue, you need to be careful and say, one, there's still a lot of discrimination going on in this society. It's still tough for anybody who doesn't have a lot of money to make it, and then you combine that with the values issue that's in the ghetto, but among only some people in the ghetto. You have to be careful about making these sweeping statements. I mean, I see kids and adults all the time who don't have a lot of money, who are really struggling every day, working very hard, trying to get an education, and doing their best to make it, and in many cases making it. So you just don't want to paint with too broad a brush.
All of these facts that we've been talking about so far kind of play into a very big theme, which plays right into the title of your book, Promises Betrayed, Waking Up from the American Dream. So what do you mean by the American dream? Because everyone seems to mean something different. And what are we waking up from?
When I think of the American dream, I guess I tend to think about the idea that you expect that in the United States you're going to be treated fairly. So fairness is one thing. And then that there's going to be expanding opportunity, that people believe that if they get an education and if they work hard, that they'll be able to do well, and especially that the next generation, their kids, will be able to do well. And that's where I think we're beginning to fall down on those two important points in terms of fairness and in terms of expanding opportunity. I don't think we're doing nearly as well as we used to and as we should.
Let's take a phone call.
Sure.
Sarah in the South Bronx, you're on Brian Lehrer Live. Thanks a lot for calling.
Oh, hi, thanks. Hi, Bob.
How are you?
Good, how are you? I graduated not that long ago from Empire State College up in State University of New York. And in the literature, I saw your picture.
There you go. That's where I got my journalism degree.
Exactly. So my question to you, although I know what my answers are, but I wanted you to say it on television, is what do you say to adults who are already established in some career but don't have a degree and think that they really don't need it? I know that we do, and it gives us a sense of accomplishment, and it also helps us advance. But there are people out there who don't think they need that. So
here's why I think it's more important now than before, even if you're an adult and even if you're, employed in a job that's pretty good. What they're telling you now is that if you're embarking on a career, that you can expect to change jobs 4 or 5 times in the course of a lifetime. And things are moving much faster, due to globalization and technological improvements and that sort of thing than in decades past. So while someone may feel comfortable now and feel that their income is sufficient, 5 or 6 years from now, they may find that they've been downsized, or their corporation has moved someplace else, or there's been a technological advance that has made your skills obsolete. So I think that it's really important to stay on top of it now. And then one other thing is that I think that your point is a good one about the idea that it gives you a sense of accomplishment. It also, going to college expands your horizon. You tend to have a richer existence if you pursue your education.
Right. I noticed that, and I found that even though I was already established and didn't think I could learn any more going to school, just gave me a different perspective on a lot of things.
Good for you.
And so it was a great experience.
Sarah, thanks a lot for your call. We appreciate it. And yet, as we talk about the decline of the American dream and the possibility of the American dream from your perspective, your Times colleague, David Brooks, had a column a week or two ago premised on how much better President Bush did in his second election with poor voters than he did the first time. And so David Brooks sees a Republican poor emerging that he characterizes as more hopeful about America, seeing their future in optimistic Republican growth economics terms, while the Democratic poor see less hope and just, more of a requirement for a stagnant safety net. Do you see that?
Well, I tend not to comment on colleagues' columns, but I would just be cautious about making sweeping statements about, any group, whether it's Democratic poor or Republican poor or anything. It would be very hard for me to comment on what the hopes are of a large group of a large slice of the Republican electorate.
And at the end of the column you wrote on jobs last week, you quote Justice Louis Brandeis, "We can have democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both."
Yeah, and I think that that's the direction in which we're heading. I think that we're sort of in a weird time at the moment. We've got this war going on in Iraq. We've got an economy that's uncertain at best. We've got tremendous government debt. We've got tremendous personal debt, household debt. People are mortgaged up to their eyes. Their credit cards are in many cases maxed out, and we're seeing record numbers of bankruptcies. So this just can't go on indefinitely. And if you begin to get crisis on top of crisis, which is the danger, then you see some of those cherished freedoms that we talk about falling apart, and people are saying, you know, well, we need to do whatever we need to do to take care of this. It's like when crime was out of control in the cities, you know, and people started, well, you're no longer worrying about civil liberties and that sort of thing. Let's just lock them up and throw away the key.
So do you think this is an inevitable increasing disparity and struggle of the middle class because of global economics, or is somebody doing this to us?
No, I think that if there's not a change in policy in the U.S., I don't think it's inevitable at all. I mean, I think that globalization is a fact of life and it's here to stay. I'm certainly not going to be in favor of rolling back technological advances, but what we really need to do is be extremely thoughtful about these matters and figure out the best way to make it work for as many Americans as possible, and I don't think we're doing that now.
Let's change subjects. The Senate today began the debate that could end in the so-called nuclear option to end filibusters against judicial nominees. I want to play you a piece of tape. Senator John McCain, who opposes the nuclear option, talking about political power and who has it and who could get it on ABC This Week on Sunday.
That's if people feel the religious conservatives have too much sway within our party, then they should get more active and regain their influence. The religious conservatives have every right to affect the policies and programs and candidates of our party. They have every right to it, and I respect it. So if to my friends who say that there's too much influence by the religious right, and I don't, I'd say, well, then get busy and regain your influence in the party.
Senator John McCain, what do you think?
Well, when I think in terms of the filibuster, and I never thought that I'd be on television defending the filibuster, which when I was a kid was used by the bigots to stop essential civil rights legislation. But when I think of the filibuster, I think not so much about the filibuster per se as what I see as this attempt to erode the checks and balances that have served the nation so well. So what the administration is trying to do is to eliminate, you know, the power of the Democratic minority in the Senate, and this is something that has gone on for such a long time. And that just goes along with the other efforts to roll back checks and balances. And what we're moving towards is a one-party government, which is not good for the United States. They want to bring down that wall that separates church and state. That's not good for the government. So I think that the fight over the filibuster is really important, but it's really part of a much larger struggle. Do you want to maintain this concept of the checks and balances, or do you not?
And here's another clip. This is Senator Mitch McConnell, Republican whip, who favors the so-called nuclear option, speaking on Fox News Sunday. And he puts this in terms of traditional politics. Mm-hmm.
What we'd like to do is to get back to the way the Senate operated quite comfortably for 214 years prior to the last Congress, where it was possible to filibuster for the purpose of defeating judicial appointments. It's just that it was never done. I mean, always nominees that enjoyed majority support, as all of the president's nominees have enjoyed majority support, were given an up or down vote, or if there were a few recalcitrant senators, both leaders would join up, file cloture, get a vote on cloture, which cuts off debate and guarantees an up or down vote.
Is he right, at least, that this is new in our history, that the filibuster is being used to stop judicial nominees?
No. What the Republicans have been trying to say is that the Democrats have this concerted effort to stop large numbers of judicial nominees of President George W. Bush. It's not the case at all. The Democrats have been trying to stop nominees that are problematic, either in the sense of being extreme in their views, or in the case of not being particularly competent. But where you really want to start making some comparisons, and this is what I really wish the public understood better, is what happened with Clinton's nominees and what happened with Bush's nominees. And so many more of Clinton's nominees were stopped by the Republicans, couldn't get out of committee, couldn't get a vote on the floor of the House. The Republicans say just bring them out for an up or down vote. That didn't happen with the Clinton nominees.
They had a different mechanism.
They had a different mechanism.
They didn't have to filibuster because they have the majority.
So they could control the committees, and the nominees would never get to the floor for a vote. The Democrats do not control the committees because they don't have a majority in either House of Congress. So they use the filibuster, and I think they've used it selectively. I mean, I don't have a problem with the way they've been using it. And they've used it selectively for those judicial appointments that they believe are beyond the pale. And it's really not that many appointments.
Is there really a principle at stake here, though, or is it partisanship? If the shoe was on the other foot and the Democrats had the majority, and Republicans were filibustering nominees, and the Democratic leader was calling for an up or down vote, which is, you know, you certainly could imagine.
Democrats and liberals have taken that. The Democrats and liberals, without talking about the nuclear option, have taken essentially the same position that the Republicans are taking now. They're saying, you know, we have the majority, we have a right to vote on these nominees, whether they were judicial nominees or nominees for other positions, and you have no right to stop it. The president has a right to make these appointments. So, sure, it's a matter of partisan political power.
And what about the idea?
But I would also mention, though, that be careful what you wish for. I mean, if the Republicans actually go for the nuclear option and get rid of the filibuster in terms of judicial nominees, there will come a time when the pendulum will go back the other way, the Democrats will have the majority, and what do we think will happen then?
Do you have an opinion about this particular judicial nominee who is a judge in Texas right now, who apparently is being put out there today as the test case, Priscilla Owen, African-American woman? Is she so far out of the political mainstream? Have you looked at her record?
I have looked at her record, but I haven't covered her, and I have not tried to get the other side on the story since I haven't written about it. So I don't really want to. I don't feel comfortable making a comment on whether I think she should be, you know, appointed or not. But I'll put it this way: from what I've seen so far, there is no question that this appointment is problematic. And
the idea of majority rule would seem to indicate that in judicial nominations, as with other things, a 51-vote majority is still a majority. Why should it take 3/5 for some things and 51% for
Because majority rule is a playground term. It's not the way a representative democracy like we have, the Republic of the United States of America, that's not the way it works here. We have checks and balances. We have three equal branches of government. We have a system that was set up to make it difficult to get a lot of things done, so that you're not supposed to be able to have the tyranny of the majority in the United States. Just because you have a majority does not mean that you get to rule everything. If there were a majority rule, then back when I was growing up in the 1950s, you know, blacks would have just been shoved in a corner, doors would have been locked, and it would have been all over. But you didn't have majority rule. You had some options. In your book, Promises Betrayed, and certainly in the paper these days, you keep writing and keep writing and keep writing about Iraq. Tell our viewers why. We can't go back and not fight the war. Why do you keep it up front? The nation is at war. I can't believe it's not the biggest single story in the country. It's just astonished by that. You've had 1,600 American troops die. You've had thousands of people Americans suffer grievous wounds. You've had thousands upon thousands of Iraqis killed, in many cases innocent Iraqi civilians. This is a horrifying, tragic story, and it's still not getting the attention that it deserves. This is a war, I agree with you. I mean, I was opposed to the war starting, but once it started, then you want a war to be fought smartly. You want the United States to win that war with a minimum of casualties, and I don't think that's what happened. I think that we sent a lot of troops over there that were not properly trained for the situation that we threw them into. We didn't protect them in many cases. We didn't give them the necessary protective armor that was needed. I object to the idea that the war is being fought by a small slice of the American population, those from the lower economic and educational stratas. And I object to the fact that we don't really have a clearly articulated goal in that war. We don't have an exit strategy. When's it going to end? Nobody knows, you know, how many people have to die before we decide, you know, this was a horrible mistake. So I just have all kinds of objections to what's going on, and it needs to be covered more closely.
You've written a lot about Abu Ghraib, and this week, of course, Newsweek finds itself at the center of a scandal for having gotten at least one piece of information wrong that some say led to riots in Afghanistan and Pakistan, having to do with the Pentagon reportedly being about to confirm that there was desecration of a Quran by flushing it down a toilet at the Guantanamo Bay prison camp, and then the source said, no, that's true. And certainly the military, the Pentagon, says, no, that's true. How serious a gaffe do you think this is?
Well, it's incredibly serious gaffe. I mean, Newsweek has been unable to confirm its story, and so, you know, they ultimately retracted it. But what's interesting to me is the incredible attention that the Newsweek story is getting. But we've had all these stories of confirmed instances of abuse of prisoners, of humiliation of Muslim detainees, of you know, sexual humiliation, of attempts to undermine their religious beliefs for purposes of interrogation or whatever. And it just seems to me that that is just so much larger a story than this gaffe by Newsweek. And so you don't have a sense of proportion, in my mind, in our approach to these two stories that are not comparable.
So, and you criticize the media in general a lot for being too timid, for allowing censorship. So you think there's all this abuse that doesn't get enough attention, and then this thing which may have exaggerated at least the certainty about a particular allegation of abuse gets too much attention from the other side?
Well, I'm not saying that it gets too much attention. I'm just saying that the attention is out of proportion. This is a major story, and it is a big foul-up. But why does this story get the amount of attention it does? And the enormous story that has to do with the policies of the United States and has to do with abuse to human beings, in some case, abuse that has resulted in the deaths of individuals, that's a story that also needs to be covered with intensity.
Although your critics on the right would say, why should the U.S. media get more outraged about these particular instances at Abu Ghraib or the desecration of a Quran at Guantanamo Bay if it took place, more outraged and focus more attention and critical energy on that than on, say, the insurgents who've killed hundreds of people in the last few weeks in Iraq?
I don't think that there should be more outrage for that. I mean, I don't think anyone is condoning terrorist acts, suicide bombers, the killing of civilians, and that sort of thing. But what I'm saying is that it's not a case. There's supposed to be something special about the United States of America. So for us to say that, you know, we're not worse than the terrorists is not sufficient. Even if we're fighting a war, we have to be better than the terrorists at all times. And if you fight wars, and one of the things I think is that the public does not understand really how brutal wars are. So, you know, I'm not naive about that. But if you're going to fight a war, then you try and keep that unnecessary brutality to a minimum, and you try and bring the war to a conclusion as quickly as possible. But most importantly, you don't fight a war unless you absolutely have no choice. Sometimes you have no choice. But if you have a choice, don't fight a war.
But there we are. And there are two camps of critics at this point, more or less two camps. Tell me if there's a third. One that says the U.S. should get out as quickly as possible because the U.S. presence is making it harder for democracy to take hold and Iraqis to begin to defend themselves, giving, you know, an excuse to the insurgents, some legitimacy to the insurgents because the U.S. is an occupying force. The other camp says we don't have enough troops in there and we should send in more to do the job right. Are you in either of those camps?
No, I'm in a third camp. I don't think that you can responsibly advocate a precipitous pullout at this point. We're responsible for so much of the chaos and the tragedy that's going on there now. What I think we really need to do, and we're not doing it, is pull together the best minds we can from around the country to assess the situation honestly, bring some new perspective to this issue, and find out in a short period of time what our policy ought to be and how we can ultimately get out of there, and whether the Bush administration, in fact, even wants to get out of there, or whether this whole war was in part an effort to establish a more or less permanent base in the Middle East.
All right. Bob Herbert, I trust you'll keep writing about Iraq.
I will.
New York Times columnist Bob Herbert. His new book is called Promises Betrayed, Waking Up from the American Dream. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
By the way, if you're interested in what another New York Times columnist has to say, tune in to my radio show on WNYC Friday morning at 10, when my guest will include Times columnist Thomas Friedman. That's at 93.9 FM and 8:20 AM. But coming up next, right here, why the New York Public Library sold a classic New York painting to, of all things, Walmart, and Mayor Miguel learned Spanish. This is Brian Lehrer Live.
Go to jail for a gun crime, and your family serves a sentence with you.
Prominent professors, outstanding students, illustrious alumni, all on the Emmy-nominated magazine show about CUNY. Hi, I'm Diana Ravinka. Join us every week as we bring you stories about the people and programs that make CUNY a place where you study with the best.
It's Brian Lehrer Live. We'll get to Mayor Miguel Habla Español in a minute, but first, take a good look at this painting. It's one of the great paintings ever of New York. Maybe you've seen it in the main branch of the New York Public Library, but it is leaving the city because the library just sold it to, of all things, the Walmart empire, which will put it in the city of Walmart headquarters, Bentonville, Arkansas. And with us on the phone now for what may be live television's first ever art history lesson, and to explain why the New York Public Library sold the painting the way it did, is New York Times art critic Michael Kimmelman. Hi, Michael. Welcome to Brian Lehrer Live.
Here.
So, what painting is this?
Well, this is a painting by Asher B. Durant. He's a great artist of the Hudson River School, and this is in many ways his best painting, which is a picture of the painter Thomas Cole with William Cullen Bryant, the journalist and poet, standing on a cliff overlooking the Catskills. And it was a picture of great hope, and it was also about these figures who were central to the history of New York in the middle of the 19th century. Bryant, a particularly great figure. And the picture itself was given by Durant to Bryant as a gift, and Bryant's daughter gave it to what was then called the Lenox Library, now the site of the Frick. And it ultimately, when the Lenox Library was absorbed by the New York Public Library, became their property.
So take this rare opportunity. We have the painting on the screen, as you can see, and give our viewers a little art crit here on television. What makes this great art? What should we be looking at here?
Well, I mean, I think this picture is both important visually, but I also think it's very important symbolically. Visually speaking, the Hudson River School really opened up an entire new realm of inquiry for American artists. It turned the American landscape with a lot of religious symbolism, spiritual ideas, and just a whole sense of manifest destiny into a great subject for American art. And it is part of the whole mid-19th century vision of America that was expressed by artists like Frederick Church, Cole before Durand, and later on Bierstadt and others. So in it is contained this vision of America, but it also has another quality, too. I mean, Durand, to be perfectly blunt, was not the greatest of American artists. This is his greatest work, and its sensitivity to light and to the nature of the landscape there, to the particular kind of closed and intimate nature of the Catskills, I think is wonderful, the atmospherics and so forth. But also this idea of nature at a time when New York was expanding, so that there was a symbolism, too, in this marriage of a New York school with an idea of the still unspoiled America out there. And that, in fact, is also what's going on with these two figures on the cliff, because Cole and Bryant represent really the arts and letters in the midst of the landscape. So they're, in a sense, the idea of civilization and landscape meeting. I think that's really the symbolism. And, of course, they're New York figures, so it's a New York meeting, essentially, in a New York place of these figures who helped to form the culture of the city and the region in the 19th century.
So, Michael, tell us how the New York Public Library came to have this painting hanging in its main branch rather than a museum, and how the public library came to sell it to Alice Walton of Walmart.
Yeah, well, as I said, Durand gave it to Bryant. Bryant, I should add, this poet and journalist, among other things, helped to create Central Park and the Metropolitan Library. The Metropolitan Museum. He passed on this painting, however, to his daughter, and she gave it to what was then called the Lenox Library, which is, as I said, on the site of the Frick. And the Lenox was ultimately absorbed by the New York Public Library. So the library owned it since about 1904, I think. And, it decided quite recently that it wanted to capitalize on certain assets that it had, which are not necessarily central to its mission as a library. This was its greatest painting. So it decided to look into what it might do to get rid of the picture. It called in Sotheby's, and Sotheby's suggested that they hold a closed bid, a kind of a rather secretive process, actually. And it was very hastily organized in a way that seems very unfortunate. By hasty, I mean that auctions are often, announced and held months later for various reasons, and one of which is to give people time to know that the auction's happening and to raise money and so forth. This one will really happen within a matter of weeks. And a closed bid meant that these sealed bids meant that people had to guess at what the price would be, send in their bid, and then the envelopes were opened, and whoever had the highest bid got the picture. This process, which is unusual, especially for the sale of what's essentially a picture in public hands, pretty much favors the richest private buyer. And the reason is because a public institution has to raise money and go to donors, and if you, let's say, bid $50 million, if you call on your donors and say you need all that money, you put that number in the envelope, you open it, you get the picture, and you discover that the second highest bid was $25 million. Your donors are not going to think you're very smart and may not trust you in the future. So it's hard for public institutions to win in closed bidding, besides which it's hard to raise $35 million, which they're sold for on short notice.
So I guess the bottom line public policy question, it's not government, so it's not public policy in the pure sense, but public interest question is, what's more in the public interest? The New York Public Library, which is a public institution, getting as much as it can for this painting so it can spend it on books and things, or making sure that the painting stays available in a New York public institution and favoring something like the Met for the purchase.
Right. I mean, that's exactly right. And the irony, of course, is that here's a picture about the meeting of the arts and letters. And what happened is that this painting, that our interest as a public in art was pitted against our interest in books, which is a particularly hideous sort of thing to have happened. I mean, my response, if I may say, is that while public institutions have a financial responsibility to get, what they can financially when they sell off essentially the public good, there's also, an investment in making sure these things stay in a public collection in the city. And I think, it would have behooved the museum, both in terms of public relations and in terms just of the serving the public, if it had found a way to allow this picture to have stayed in a place like the Met, or at least to have given the Met or some other New York museum recourse at the end.
Michael Kimmelman, thanks a lot for doing this. And I guess the bottom line is, if Walmart can't bring a store to New York, it will bring New York to Walmart, maybe one piece at a time. Or maybe we can make Walmart a deal. They can have a store in the Queens Center Mall as long as they hang the painting there. What do you think? All right, Michael Kimmelman, thank you very much for doing this. Now, next up on Brian Lehrer Live, Mayor Bloomberg has spent the first of his expected gazillion dollars in TV advertising on a Spanish language ad that debuted yesterday, Hello, Fernando Ferrer, followed by an English language ad today touting his record on security, crime reduction, and education. We will talk about that and other New York politics now, as well as the historic election of a Latino mayor in Los Angeles yesterday, with Daily News columnist Errol Lewis and El Diario La Prensa editorial page editor Evelyn Hernandez. Welcome to Brian Lehrer Live.
Thank you.
And we did have that historical election of Antonio Villaraigosa yesterday, so perhaps it's no coincidence that this Michael Bloomberg ad debuted on the same day on TV here in New York. Let's take a look at this ad for viewers who have not seen it.
En los últimos 4 años hemos progresado contra viento y marea.
Porque somos neoyorquinos.
Hoy estamos viviendo un renacer económico en los 5 condados. Nueva York es una de las ciudades más seguras del país. Y día a día estamos mejorando nuestras escuelas públicas.
Todavía hay mucho por hacer. Pero con el esfuerzo de todos, lo mejor está por venir.
All right, Evelyn, what do you say?
Well, he's made a good effort at speaking Spanish, but you know, at the end of the day, what Hispanics want to know is, are you going to provide good jobs, good education, decent housing? Will I be able to put food on the table? And those are really the issues that people want to hear about in English or in Spanish.
Sure, but what do you say?
Well, as I said, it's a good effort. He said the best is yet to come, and some people think that some of his pronunciation sounds more like I'd like more chicken. But I think that Hispanics appreciate the effort and think it's a good try anyway.
Right. I mean, Errol, do you speak Spanish?
Just a little bit, un poquito.
It's you know, it's easy for us to sit here and make fun of that ad and say, okay, that's Mayor Bloomberg. He's obviously speaking with a very, you know, white Jewish Boston accent. But do you think that Latino New Yorkers really appreciate just the gesture of having done this? Almost like when you travel in a foreign country and you can barely speak the language, they appreciate it if you try, rather than assuming that everybody's going to come to you and speak English.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's worth doing. I mean, you could call it pandering. On the other hand, the community being pandered to usually reacts favorably. I mean, politicians do this for a reason. You know, you go to somebody's neighborhood and you put on the silly hat, and you speak whatever 3 or 4 words of Polish you know when you go to Greenpoint. You know, you do the same thing in Russian when you go to Coney Island. It's a smart move on his part. I mean, he's got a huge financial advantage. It'll be weeks, if not months, before Freddie Ferrer can put on a 90-second TV commercial in Spanish. You know, it could even end up being, people will say, gee, who's this other guy, Freddie Ferrer? I didn't know he could speak Spanish.
But would he ever, Evelyn, would he ever put on a Spanish-language television ad, Freddie Ferrer, or does he need to reach the other way, and so he doesn't want to look too Hispanic?
Oh no, he'll do an ad probably in July or August, from what I understand. But it comes down to money. I mean, Freddie Ferrer and the other Democratic candidates, none of them have the money to start paying for television advertising this early in the campaign. Strategically, if you don't have the money, then you wait until later on in the campaign to do that. But Fernando Ferrer has had advertising in the Spanish language community before, and will surely do it again. Absolutely.
What about money? Errol Lewis.
Listen, we just closed out a financial reporting period, and the Campaign Finance Board reports that all of the candidates, there's dozens if not hundreds of them at this point, running for all the 51 council seats and all of the different borough presidencies and the citywide seats, have collectively spent about $20 to $21 million on their campaign so far, and 11 of that is the mayor. And that's, you know, that's about 1/10 of what he's estimated to spend by the time this is all over. So, you know, we are going to see a real onslaught. That is not going to be the last ad you see. And there'll be other languages and there'll be other images, and he's going to certainly make his case early and often.
We have a couple of clips to play of some of the Democratic mayoral hopefuls from their appearance on Kurtzman and Company on Channel 2 last week. And I want to get your reactions to these. Here are Virginia Fields and Anthony Weiner first on who's a new Democrat, and Weiner's charge that Virginia Fields and her career track represents the old Democrats.
Come from. I'm really proud in terms of having come through government, actually starting at community boards, a very important part of our governmental structure.
What's wrong with that? What's wrong with that?
Continuing as a city council member and as a borough president. And I'm very pleased that my focus in terms of how I would govern has evolved out of this work.
You know, there isn't anything wrong with it, and I honor it. It's just an old way of doing things. It's an old-fashioned view of the city.
How is it old-fashioned in terms of having a view of wanting a mayor who's going to focus on the priorities and the needs of the people in this city in a way that is not being done, including affordable housing, education, jobs? I've talked about creating a deputy mayor that will focus on employment, helping to put back to work the perpetually unemployed group. No mayor has done that, and that's critically important.
Look, I think it's an old-fashioned approach to create a new...
To create jobs?
I think it's an old-fashioned approach to create a new city hall bureaucracy to do things.
Okay, that from Kurtzman and Company on Channel 2 on Sunday. Evelyn, what were they both trying to do there?
Well, Virginia Fields is trying to shift her image that she has. She's been criticized as being too soft and too genteel almost, and she's really come on strong in the last couple of weeks. She was trying to make her point and trying to get her point across there, and she's trying to present herself as someone with a track record, you know, trying to point out her history as a politician in the city. And you know, and Anthony Weiner is painting himself as this young maverick, you know, upstart, an outsider trying to come in and you know and bring new ideas to City Hall, and that's what he's trying to portray.
Errol, what would you say about that exchange?
It was interesting to me. It's amazing to me to see somebody like Anthony Weiner talk about the old-fashioned way being the way that comes from inside government, because first of all 4 of the candidates are either current or former city council members. And in particular, Weiner, as well as Gifford Miller, they've never worked in the private sector. I mean, they worked for politicians. They kind of went pretty much straight from college to working as an intern or a gopher in some politician's office. And then when the chance came, they ran for office themselves. So I'm not sure what newness Weiner is talking about. You know, I mean, Virginia Fields has a record outside of government, you know, a community activist record. The other thing worth mentioning is that when she talks about working within the system, within the community boards and so forth, she's really making a pitch to ordinary community activists who are, in fact, a constituency and an important one in this city. She's also talking about people who work for the city. You know, there's a couple 100,000 people who work for the city. Many of them, or if not most of them, are members of unions. That is a tangible, definable, important constituency that she is trying to capture. That's what I hear her saying.
Which raises an issue, I think, for the rest of the city, and that is, do you want the employer to be beholden to the employees? She has to negotiate with respect to how many of everybody's tax dollars are going to be spent on these unions, right? And so is that in the greater public interest?
Well, it is a question that will come out clearly in the general election, because the mayor's had, you know, various levels of conflict with most of the important unions. He's really cut very few deals, you know, compared with, say, his predecessors. And so he, in fact, isn't beholden, not for money, not for troops. And in a lot of cases, he's done what is almost the worst thing to do politically, which is to leave a contract hanging the way he has with the teachers union going into an election season. So that will be a question on the table for the general election. In the primary, you know, I think it's going to be a question of those who don't get the union endorsements, those who don't get the support, will point the finger at the others and say, you're too beholden to DC 37, you know, who I was begging to endorse me just last week.
And for our viewers, you know, there are polls out there that have all kinds of numbers, but I suspect that most of you are really undecided, if you're registered Democrats, who you're going to vote for in this primary election. What do you want to see? What do you want to know from any of these candidates before you make up your mind? Give us a call, 212-251-0801, 212-251-0801. And we're going to play another clip now from Kurtzman and Company on an issue. This time we're going to see Fernando Ferrer and Anthony Weiner, and the issue of all things for a mayoral race is the war in Iraq.
Look, many of us Democrats had strong convictions going in. I would have voted against that war. I believe the theory of preemption, not only in Iraq, but here in New York City, has been discredited. It is discredited. We went to war for exactly the wrong reasons and put too many young American lives at risk.
Where were you during that period? Where were you for our party? Where were you during that debate? I mean, it's easy to say that now. These were very difficult decisions that we needed to make.
So, Evelyn Hernandez, is that a relevant question that Anthony Weiner is raising? I mean, Weiner was in Congress where they were debating the war. Fernando Ferrer, I think, was working for a think tank that was doing research on middle-class economics. Was it Fernando Ferrer's place to step out and start declaiming about the war in Iraq?
No, Anthony Weiner, Fernando Ferrer was with the Drum Major Institute. That was where he spent the time between 2001 and launching the candidacy.
That's a think tank.
Anthony Weiner seems to just, in this campaign, seems to be just attacking the other candidates without really a whole lot of thought sometimes to how much sense it makes. I mean, I saw a cartoon that portrayed him as just a mouth, and I think sometimes that's a problem. He's a very smart guy. He's very quick, but at times he does ask irrelevant questions or unreasonable questions, it would seem. Fernando Ferrer has been asking the question of, had been raising the question of, I know where I was, where were you, in response to the Amadou Diallo criticisms. And perhaps that's where that question came from with Weiner, but it didn't make a whole lot of sense when you thought about it.
Let's take a phone call. This is Edward in Chelsea. Hi, you're on Brian Lehrer Live.
Hi, Brian. You have a great show. Glad to be talking to you.
Thanks a lot.
As far as your question about what I would like to see from the Democratic Party, I hate to be saying this, but a whole new crop of candidates. Ferrer is an also-ran retread that just keeps changing depending on which way the wind blows. He's a city council mayor type of John Kerry. Can't make a decision until you tell him what it is. Anthony Weiner is just so green and rude, and he's not going to make many friends that way. Miss Fields, she's a wonderful lady, but I don't think she has the backbone to govern the city. And Gifford Miller, need I say more? I mean, he's probably the weakest of all of them. And I'd just like to see there are people with more gravitas to them, something more statesmanship, more intelligence, more of a background, just strength.
So, Edward, let me ask you, you sound like your leanings are toward the Democratic Party, but are you going to vote for Bloomberg almost no matter who gets this nomination?
Right now, Bloomberg seems to be the only person that has any substance to him, and I'm sorry, and he's not really raising the bar very high, and if you can't reach that,
all right.
I'm sorry.
Thank you for your call. Well, Errol Lewis, maybe that's the dirty little unspeakable truth of this entire campaign, that none of these four Democrats have a particular lot of gravitas. They've each certainly done some things in their careers, and sometimes things that haven't made the news very much that people don't know about that are accomplishments. But when you compare them in terms of, compare them to Mayor Bloomberg in terms of an overall vision for where they want to lead the city, they all come up wanting.
Well, some of that I think is the still lingering echoes from September 11th, 2001, which is to say, if you say to yourself, who would I want to be the mayor of the city if, God forbid, something like that should happen again? Who of them would I have felt comfortable, being in the seat of power when all hell was breaking loose at ground zero? And that's the stature gap that I think the caller's talking about. And the irony is, especially for some of these folks who have spent their whole lives or most of their adult lives in politics waiting for this moment to try and lead the city, just when they're stepping up to try and get the job, the nature of the job really has changed in a fundamental kind of a way. And it's not anybody's fault in particular, but, you know, these 4 candidates 10 years ago would have been perfectly acceptable. And I don't think you'd get reactions like the caller was expressing.
Any disagreement, Evelyn?
Well, I think certainly that you know, there's one CEO in the bunch, and that's Mike Bloomberg, and he carries himself as a CEO, sometimes to the distress of the people that he's leading, but he does have that presence. And I think an element, though, that we haven't talked about is the fact that Fernando Ferrer, if he were to be elected, would become the city's first Hispanic mayor. And I think that Bloomberg's ads yesterday certainly addressed that in an indirect way, if not in a very direct way. Bloomberg is very conscious of the fact that he won 4 years ago, in part because the Latino voters were very upset with the way that Mark Green carried out his primary campaign, and the fact that the Democratic Party did not step in and put a stop to it, or at least you know, warn or pull the coat of Mark Green in that whole process, and that certainly helped Mayor Bloomberg. So he's very conscious of that vote this time around.
We have a minute left. Do you think there are any lessons for New York from the election of Antonio Villaraigosa in Los Angeles yesterday, or are the politics of the two cities just so different?
Well, Villaraigosa was able to do this time around what he wasn't able to do 4 years ago, and it's interesting because the two of them ran 4 years ago and both of them lost. But Freddie was the much stronger candidate 4 years ago. Villaraigosa put together a coalition in that city of all the constituencies: blacks, Asians, whites, African Americans. He was helped some by the fact that James Hahn is involved in a terrible scandal, but mostly it was because he presented himself as a candidate for all the people, and Hispanics and blacks felt included in that.
And that's the last word. Evelyn Hernandez from El Diario, Era Lewis from the Daily News, thank you very much. And that's it for this week's Brian Lehrer Live. Remember, we are live every Wednesday night at 7. Next week, our guests will include Jamaican lesbian performance artist Stacey Ann Chin, who needed to postpone her appearance scheduled for tonight. And join me for my radio show on WNYC, New York Public Radio, weekday mornings at 10. Tomorrow morning, my guests will include Natan Sharansky and Fernando Ferrer. That's tomorrow morning at 10 on WNYC at AM 820 and FM 93.9. Have a great night. The AMT